Well, it's been a whirlwind day here in Westminster, so let's get Labour's take now, because we are now joined by Jim McMahon, who is the party Shadow Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Secretary. Thanks for being with us. Well, let's start with Boris Johnson, shall we? What do you make of the evidence?
I think anybody seeing the performance, and it was a performance, in Parliament today, I think will be left feeling quite frustrated, because, for me, this can't be viewed for how we feel today, how we live our lives today. We're free today, we can see our friends and family today, we can socialise today. If we have loved ones in care homes, we can see them today. That wasn't what was happening when Boris Johnson was breaking the rules and holding them parties in Downing Street. And I think his lack of empathy and understanding about what people really went through for those sacrifices, I think, for me, is the biggest mistake he's made in that representation. Was
there a blurring of the lines, though, for people who were allowed within the rules to work together, who were working in stressful environments, who might have had a glass of wine or a beer at the end of the day's work? When we saw, of course, which I know a lot of people by social media are flagging up, Keir Starmer with a beer in Durham as well.
And that's what the rules allowed for. The rules were...
Because that's what he was saying there as well. Boris Johnson says the guidance was followed.
Well, not particularly, because this was about what you could do that avoided unnecessary contact. We were all asked to keep 2 metres, or if not at least a metre. We were all asked to undergo changes to our daily routines. The difference here, and people do make the equivalents in the way that you've said, first of all, that Keir Starmer didn't break the rules. He's pretty clear that he's a rule maker, not a rule breaker. And that was found during the inquiry from Durham Police. But they were staying away for work purposes. Boris Johnson and the staff who worked in Downing Street were there as their office, and they were having parties, birthday parties. Cake was brought in. They literally went to Tesco with suitcases, bringing in bottles of wine. That wasn't what was happening in care homes. It wasn't happening in hospital wards. And that's what we've got to compare it to. And it was Boris Johnson, you know, in the evening at the podium saying to people, listen, this is really important. We need to stay at home, we need to save lives, and we need to protect the NHS. And people did that. They made the sacrifices. I know what my family went through in terms of making sacrifices, not seeing each other.
What did your family go through then?
Well, not being able to celebrate birthdays, not being able to meet on the anniversary of the passing away of a grandparent. The times when you would come together as a family to support each other weren't there. And in a way, we were the lucky ones. We didn't have an elderly person in a care home. But if we did, imagine the wrench that you would feel today watching that performance in Parliament when potentially somebody that you loved, that you cared for, that raised you in a care home, you weren't able to see in the final moments because you made the sacrifice, because you were asked to, for the national interest. And Boris Johnson didn't do that. I just think he's tone deaf to where the public are on this.
Do you think that some people might be looking at this and thinking, look, it's time to move on now? And, you know, Boris Johnson has been fined by police. We've been through all this before. People's have made up their minds on this already. Why are we just going over the same ground?
Well, I think integrity in politics really matters. I don't buy the argument at all that all politicians are the same, that we're all in it for ourselves, that poor behaviour in the way that we're seeing and selfish behaviour is normal and should be accepted. I think the bar should be high and the public have a right for it to be high. And I think the danger in what we're seeing in Parliament is being kind of dragged into the gutter allows him to say, but everyone was doing it. Everyone was breaking the rules. You know, I know that everyone was at it. Everyone was not at it. I know people that work in the NHS. I know people that work in care homes. I know people that work for local councils. I know people right across the industry in retail and other places who stuck to the rules because they were asked to, and they realised that there was a lot at stake here. Like, people were dying, the pandemic was ripping through society, and people that we cared about were being lost. That was the context. We can't view what's going on today through today's context, where we're living our lives in a freer way. In terms of, should we just move on? Which is, a question that I've seen being asked. I think that accountability matters, and an inquiry by its nature is backward-looking. That's what an inquiry does. And for a political accountability, it's important that the Prime Minister of the day, who asked so much of the nation, is held to account for the rules that he set.
OK. Well, look, we heard from Boris Johnson today. We'll hear more, I'm sure, as that goes on. He says, of course, that he did follow the rules and that he didn't willfully or intentionally mislead Parliament. I'm keen to ask you about Rishi Sunak's tax affairs as well, because he has published those today. It shows what I guess we knew already, that he's a wealthy individual. Does that matter?
It doesn't matter that he's welfare. In fact, fair play for somebody who's done well and who earns that kind of money. It does mean he isn't experiencing the cost of living crisis in the way that many of us are, and I think a bit more understanding from the Prime Minister and the Chancellor about the everyday struggles that people are facing, I think, would go a long way to rebuilding trust and faith
I
in
guess
democracy.
a lot of people think most MPs are relatively wealthy. If you look at, and I know there are different levels, but if you look at the rest of the country.
Well, I mean, I left school at 15. I've worked in many of the jobs that my constituents work in, and I know what it's like to struggle and not be able to pay bills and make the choices about who in the family eats. I know what it's like to struggle, and that, by the way, was in very different circumstances. We had family tax credits that helped us. I see people today that are really struggling to make ends meet and a government that isn't providing the support that's needed. You know, Labour's made calls for instance, the non-dom tax status to be changed. We've made calls for the 1% pension break that's currently being put through that's costing £1 billion not to be prioritised in favour of support for working people. And the Prime Minister hasn't done that. So it's not about his personal wealth. We knew that he was well off. It was about, but does he understand the real-life lived experience of working people in Britain? And I think the evidence says from the budget that he just doesn't.
What about capital gains tax? You're talking there about tax policy, because what these tax affairs do also show is that the amounts of tax that you pay through capital gains tax is, of course, at a substantially lower rate to income tax. Is that fair?
Well, I think we are going to have to have a review of how tax in the UK is balanced, whether it's right and fair and proportionate, and whether it's equity for people regardless of their work status. Rachel Reeves, of course, will be bringing forward those plans as we get closer to the election. There'll be more to say on that. But what we said for this budget is that we can do far more on non-dom tax status. We can do far more on the 1% who'll benefit from the pension break to help working people today.